Good afternoon, everyone. After the enthralling session that we had with Professor Kevin Potter from Austria, who was talking about literatures and migration, I'm very happy that we are joined by Professor Kalyan Sekhar Chakraborty, all the way from Canada. It's very early morning and over there, and good morning to you, sir. And I'm very happy that Professor Chakraborty will be talking about something which is quite connected with what Kevin was talking about. He was talking about migrations, and Professor Chakraborty will be talking about the borderlessness of representations. So that is very interesting. So I'll just start the session with the formal introduction of Professor Kalyan Sekhar Chakraborty. So Dr. Kalyan Sekhar Chakraborty is a recent PhD graduate from the Department of Anthropology, University of Toronto, Canada, specializing in South Asian archaeology. He is currently working as a research fellow at the Laboratory for Interdisciplinary Research on Archaeological Ceramics, Mcmaster University, Canada, and field direct at ASI Heritage. Along with his work in South Asia, he also is carrying out archaeological researches in Canada and Jordan. He has published many archaeological research papers in national and international journals, including Nature. Wow, that is a big thing. His specializations include molecular and isotopic analysis of archaeological ceramics, isotopic analysis of human and animal bones, morphological analysis of human skeletal remains, archaeological excavations, GIS, and photogrammetry. So as I was saying in the morning session as well, that literature studies and anthropological studies have a very deep intersectionality because they almost go hand in hand together. So without much ado, let me cordially invite the speaker for our fourth plenary, in fact, the fifth plenary and the last plenary for today, Professor Kalyan Sekhar Chakraborty. So the stage is all yours, sir.
Yeah, thank you, Nilanjan, and thank you, Arpita ma'am, for giving me this opportunity. It will be a pleasure to talk in front of a very different audience. I have been mostly talking in front of archaeologists throughout my career, so it will be definitely a very different perspective, and I would also like to hear what you all feel about my research. So I'll mostly talk about my research as well as how, as an individual, I am dealing with Indian archaeology to a certain extent. So just let me share my screen. So borderland and conflict within the Indus civilization. So when we talk about ancient Indian civilizations or archaeology in general, we talk very little about borderlands. We talk a lot about conflicts for sure, but very little about borderland and how permeable are these borderlands without a need of a conflicting situations. So today I will be talking about how within the civilization we can see different borderlands, we can see different peripheries, and how those peripheries interacted with each other, but not getting into a formal conflict. So this is a general map of Indus civilization. Indus civilization is mostly, or Harappan civilization is mostly located into the northwestern and western frontier of India, now Pakistan, a part of Pakistan, Afghanistan, and to certain extents all the way up to Iran. So when we talk about in the civilization, we kind of see a whole map, a map of entire Indus civilization. Now this map is a very top-down view of the civilization. So everything has been connected to the center of the Indus civilization rather than looking regions within the Indus civilization and see how similar or different they are. So Harman in 1989 has kind of given the sense of different domains and peripheries within the Indus civilization. So we definitely have the Sindh domain that is a marked area, and then we have different domains. So for example, northwestern domain, the Kuli domain, and the Sora domains. Now, when I call them domain, or when archaeologically we call them domain, they have certain traits from the center, from the core, but they also have their individual traits. There has been arguments that a lot of people from the center, from the Sindh region, has migrated to these different domains and kind of established kind of a regional manifestation of the Indus civilization. Now, this has been a predominant mode of interpretation until 1990s, but now the orientation of such perspective is changing, and we're trying to focus how indigenously these traditions can be developed, and the similarities that we see is a product of interaction rather than a product of migration and then assimilation within the peripheries, especially when we talk about the domains. Now, when we look at the major Harappan settlements, we see all the settlements: Harappa, Mohenjo-daro, Dholavira, Ganveriwala, Rakhigari. They are all situated in this central Sindh region. When we talk about periphery, say for example, this where the Sorath domain is the present day Saurashtra of Gujarat, we see this highly specialized settlements. Say for example, Lothal is identified as a workshop and trading settlement. So we kind of see this similar settlements, and based on these settlements, it has been argued that this expansion into further south, further west, and further north was kind of to facilitate trade, to kind of acquire more raw materials that kind of came into Gujarat, came into the core region, and then again dispersed from there through all these ports into the Arabian Sea and the Western world. My work is here, the red marked area, because this is where I saw a kind of movement of people from the Sorath domain up to the Sindh domain, and from the Sindh domain down to the Sorath domain. Now this could be it is difficult to say whether there has been an active migration of people, which is very unlikely that there has been migration of people, because we have data that suggests that even before the beginning of Indus civilization, these regions were occupied by multiple regional communities. So it is most likely a combination of movement of people, a combination of movement of idea, a combination of movement of traits. So when I say the one more thing is that, so this is the present day Kutch region of Gujarat where I conducted my study. So in Kutch region, I can see the traits that are coming from the core region, because this has been identified as part of the core region. So the settlements, the traits that are central to the core region were identified as classical Harappan traits. And then the traits that we see in the peripheral region, that is the Sorath domain, we see we call the traits as Sorath traits. So when I say classical Harappan traits and Sorath traits, this is kind of a very generalized difference within these traits. Now, in traditionally, every settlements were considered to be in the settlements within that boundary. So little effort has been made to identify how different they are, rather than there has been efforts to identify how similar they are. Also, the other reason of this difference and similar is that archaeology in general is very much biased to the environmental adaptational concept, rather than looking into the socio-political complexities, looking into the agencies and individualities that might create these differences. So most of the time it has been argued that whatever traits they're adapting is primarily to adapt to the climate, to the environment. And when we talk about Indus civilization, we know that there has been a lot of argument saying that the primary reason behind the decline of this civilization was environment, and very little effort has been given at how internal and external functioning of the civilization as a unit affected how this civilization sustained, and later on how this civilization kind of declined. So when we talk about classical Harappan settlements, you see the settlements are well built. They're huge. They have this, traditional Indus settlement pattern, like 90-degree angles, east-west orientation, east-west, north-south orientation, all these things. The settlements, the Sorat culture settlements, as you can compare, they're not that greatly built. They're very, I mean, like, they have the traits. They have these rectangular houses and roads and things like that. But when you compare to the labor and effort given to build these classical Harappan type settlements, were not there in the Sorat type settlements. In terms of pottery distribution, again, at these Sorat settlements, we see a lot of pottery vessels that are regionally developed. Then we see at the classical Harappan settlements that there is a clear indication that the pottery assemblage as a whole were similar. Now, the production of the pottery could be regional versus adaptation to the style and features. We see things like, for example, seals and ceilings. We see indication of craft production. We see indications of a lot of trade. Now, these kind of things are absent, obviously, in Sorat type settlements, and that is one of the reasons that the Sorat type settlements were identified as regional agro-pastoral settlement rather than craft producing or trading settlements. But that's not true, because at settlement of Lothal, we see indication of Sorat type materials. Even at certain classical Harappan settlements from Kutch, we see the presence of Sorat type materials. So there has been there is not clear indication when we can say a settlement as classical Harappan settlement and settlement a Sorat Harappan settlement, because at certain time during the Indus civilization, we can see all these traits are coming together and forming a uniform culture in this region. I'll come to that later. The other things are these weights and measuring systems. So you can see, for example, the settlement of Dholavira in Kutch. They had a huge variety of weights, and you can clearly identify them as weights. They have been measuring and weighing not only large things but also very small things, because some of the weights are very tiny. So they were also measuring those things. Now, weights in general are absent at Sorat settlement time. There are some weights that were probably used at these settlements, but when compared up to the variety and extent of weights used in the Sorat in the classical type settlements are generally absent. Similarly, terracotta materials, for example, we know how rich Harappans were in terms of making their terracotta items. We have animal figurines, human figurines, stoikers, bangles, you name it, they had it. But then that kind of an assemblage is completely absent in Sorat type of settlements. For example, this is the settlement of Kotadabadli where I worked, and that's all they had in terms of their terracotta material. So they have a few spindle saws, a few hopscotch, a few stylus, and beads. That's it. And that's also true for other semi-precious stone objects. For example, faience, carnelian, blades, jasper. They used a wide variety of agate. They used a wide variety of stones that they used to make beads, as they used to make bangles. Some were used to make seals, and seals. Some were used to make blades. So all that variety of stones that were used are absent in the settlements. And most of the times we see a little bit of every type of stone in the settlements, mostly in the complete form. So it is unlikely that these people were producing them, rather than they were most likely acquiring them from neighboring classical Harappan settlements. At the same time, the quality of material, the quality of raw material, and the quality of stones that we see at classical Harappan settlements are absent in the Sorat settlements, even if they're two neighboring settlements. So Gujarat in general had a lot of raw material that has been exploited by Harappans during the Harappan period. So even though these were locally made to a certain extent, they were not widely distributed between different kind of settlements, or there has been a clear indications of differential access to these resources and to these final products between these two types of traditions or excuse me, or settlements. Now, when we talk about regional and interregional interactions, in Gujarat particularly, because there has been a lot of study in Gujarat compared to the other parts of the Indus civilization. It's not ideal, it's not the best among the lot, it's not the best within the world, but it's definitely best among the lot. So there is this traditional migration model, as I briefly introduced earlier, is that earlier there has been a belief that in the civilization developed in the Indus Valley region, then it dispersed into different parts of the west northwestern frontier of an Indian peninsula, and then created these domains and created these regional manifestations. We're now kind of shifted to a point where we are arguing about the regional development of these traditions. So say, for example, there has been attempt by many Indian scholars to see and to trace if the Sora traditions were regionally developed from the regional Chalcolithic cultures of Gujarat. Now, is there a clear indications that those have been developed regionally? No, there's no clear indications, but it is likely that the Sorat tradition we see is kind of a mixture of regional tradition as well as the Harappan tradition. But there is definitely a huge role that the regional tradition played in terms of developing this Sorat tradition, because in earlier Chalcolithic period, other than Harappan period, we don't see this Sorat tradition. The Sorat traditions is very much a part of Indus Valley civilization, because as soon as the Indus tradition starts, somewhere around 3000 BC is when we start seeing the development of this Sorat tradition. Now, recently, a few of my colleagues have came up with this inter-regional integration model. So what they have basically argued is that these people in Gujarat, particularly in Kutch and Saurashtra, kind of had a dual personality. So one personality they used to get interacted with the core region, from where they accessed all their resources in terms of elite resources. And then on the other side, they had another personality that is more focused toward the region. So then they have this regional integration model, excuse me, as well, where they interacted with the regional agro-pastoral communities, and through that interactions, we can see this movement of food items and labor from down to top, and crafts from top to bottom. So this kind of movement. Now, in my PhD, I have, so again, when we talk about this inter-regional integration model, so the model I developed for my PhD is not so different from what this inter-regional model is, but then my aim was to tell the other side of the story. So in this model, they have told that how major things were moving from top to bottom. My aim was to identify the things that were produced at the bottom that moved to the top. So then I came up with the concept of staple surplus production and cooperative interaction within the Gujarat. Now, when I say cooperative interaction, the reason behind calling it as a cooperative interaction rather than a coercive interaction is that there is very little evidence of any sort of conflicts within the civilization. Now, there could be smaller conflicts that are smaller than the larger conflicts. Like there is little evidence of any sort of war. There is little evidence of any sort of vandalism or breaking into the settlements or destroying settlements. People have argued, because another thing is very interesting. I'll come later on in my presentation, is that there is a lot of ash in many of the settlements in Gujarat, and scholars have argued that this ash could be a very non so helpful and kind of violent movement of Sorat people who kind of burned these classical Harappan settlements and settled over there. But that's not the case, and I'll talk about that later. So the settlement I worked during my PhD is called Kodarabatli. Now, if you have seen these nice, beautiful Harappan settlements, and when you see Kodarabatli, you see that this is not of that standard. The other reason being that this is a very small rural settlement compared to these larger settlements that we often talk about. But again, we have to remember that not even maybe 10% of Harappans were elites. Majority of them still practiced rural agropastoralism, and that's what shaped the Indus civilization. We talk a lot about the shiny objects that we find from big settlements like Harappa, Mohenjo-daro, Rakhigarhi, Dholavira, and that's what we have learned as a whole, as a major part of Indus civilization. But that was not the case. We have hundreds and thousands of sites that are smaller, that is quite similar to this nature, and they have had very little impact in narrating the story of Indus civilization. And so that's what another reason of me choosing one of these smaller settlements to conduct my study. So this settlement is located in Kutch at the confluence of two rivers. These rivers are not perennial, they're seasonal. So mostly in the summer and mostly in the monsoon, we get a lot of water, but then there's not a lot of water. When we talk about craft production at this settlement, so they have some Harappan objects. So for example, they have quite a few of shell objects, they have stone objects, they have terracotta, and they also have metal objects. Now, enter 3 years of excavation, this is all the shiny things we have found at this settlement. Now, shell is a very common appearance in Gujarat, particularly because of this long coastline. So shell has been utilized and exploited by Harappans in this region. So we see these shell objects coming to this settlement. Most of the objects we see at the site of Kotadapatli are finished. So they are either broken or they are complete. We don't see any evidence of production of these objects at this settlement. Now, some household level production or modification is possible, but not to that extent where we can call this the residents of the settlement of Kotadapatli as a workshop, or the settlement of Kotadapatli as a workshop where this kind of objects are made, which is very interesting, because a lot of the settlements in Kutch are actually workshops where a lot of these artifacts were made. Say, for example, many settlements in Saurashtra region of Gujarat were engaged in the production of shell objects. A lot of the settlements in Kutch were engaged in the production of stone objects. They were also exploiting metal from the nearby quarries. So many of the settlements were actually producing these artifacts and trading these artifacts, but Kotadapalli was not one of those. So the next economic activity they could have performed, and they were likely performing, were agriculture and pastoralism. Now, when we look at the landscape, the present landscape of Kutch is not so different from what we expect during the Indus civilization. Yes, it was more of an island at that time than what we see now, but it has been dry. It has been not ideal for agricultural production. We don't see a lot of agricultural production in Kutch during the Indus civilization in general. So say, for example, wheat and barley were more of a Indus Valley crop rather than a Gujarat crop. So in Gujarat, we see a huge production of millets that are mostly drought resistant, because rainfall was a factor even then. They were consuming mostly millets. They were cultivating mostly millet. Also, when we talk about cultivation, there is very little evidence of any sort of irrigation during that time. They were probably managing rainfall to certain extents and modifying how rainwater has been used, but not to certain extent when we can call it as a formal irrigation system. So they didn't have that irrigation system. So they had to rely a lot on the seasonal rainfall, and that's why they adapted to more of a millet compared to wheat and barley, wheat particularly, because millets can be grown in this dry condition. We also have a very little bit evidence of rice, but the evidence of rice are mostly coming from phytoliths rather than rice grains. Now many swampy plants could have phytoliths that are similar to rice. So even though they look like rice, they need not to be rice. But this landscape is exceptional for pastoralism, because they have this huge expansion of grasslands, and we all know about the famous Manini grassland that's located in Kutch. So this has been an exceptional location for pastoralism, and that's what the residents of Kotadapalli were doing. because they were most likely doing pastoralism compared to agriculture or craft production. And pastoralism is our pastoral products. So, for example, animal powers, animal product, were something that they were producing and exchanging with this classical Harappan settlements. Now, that's the hypothesis I built and I came from to test during my PhD, and this is what I did. So, so now my next aim was to identify that to what extent animals were raised, because if I need to know if agriculture was a thing that was performed at the site, if I need to know if pastoralism a thing that was practiced in the site, I need to know how plants and animals were raised in this region. Now, I had the opportunity because of my background that I can use both anthropological theories as well as very scientific studies together to come up with a theory or come up with an interpretation, which is often not the case when we talk about Indus archaeology, because either we have a lot of scientists working on Indus archaeology and come up with a very environmentally dependent interpretation where, it's always been thought as we are always adapting. So no, we're not always adapting. At the same time, yes, we are adapting to a certain extent, but at the same time, we are also modifying our environment according to our need. So at the same time we are adapting, we're constantly changing the environment as well. So we are unlikely that we are constantly adapting and continuously, as the environment changes, we adapt, we form something else. As the environment change again, something else. No, we're constantly modifying the environment and we're constantly adapting. So there is a natural phenomena in terms of our culture, development of our culture, but then there's this huge socio-political phenomena as well that kind of helped in developing this culture. Now, what is the limitation of us talking a lot about, socio-political interpretation? Is that fragmentary evidence, because when we talk about archaeology is not full of data. We have very fragmentary evidences, and often it is easy to talk about nature than to talk about human behavior because of the generalized nature of data, and that is why if we need to go beyond this natural or adaptational environmental adaptational interpretation, we need to incorporate this smaller size, because we're losing or we're leaving behind a huge pool of data, and especially when we're dealing with this huge set civilizations, it's very important that we talk about this smaller size. So when I looked into the animals remains from the settlement of Kotattabadli, a very interesting pattern appears. So what I did is this on top is an animal tooth or from a cattle, and then I sequentially sampled the tooth to analyze the isotope content of the tooth. So I did carbon, oxygen, and strontium. So this is the carbon isotope data. So when we look into the carbon isotope data, it shows that cattle over here were differentially raised than goats over here, and that's the only sheep we had. Now, partially that is because how the dietary pattern of cattle is different than the dietary pattern of goats. Cattle is more grass, goats is more of leaves. So a lot of grass in this region were coming from C4 type vegetation, and a lot of leaves in this region were coming from C3 type vegetation. Just to give you a brief of what is the C4 and C3 type vegetation. So C4 are, for example, millets, sugarcane, corn. These are our C4 type grasses, and then the C3 type grasses would be wheat, barley, rice, all the other grasses you can literally think about. And most of the leafy plants, any leafy plants, are generally C3. So when I say a lot of C4 grasses, so it's mostly coming out from agricultural production, but there could be natural grasses in this region as well that kind of give a C4 type signature. So when we talk about carbon isotopes, so C4 will have a different carbon isotope signature, C3 will have a different carbon isotope signature, and that's what we saw at the settlement of Kotattabadli. Now, when I compared my data to the neighboring, classical Harappan settlement, what I see is that their cattle Like they also have this clear signature that cattle were raised different versus their goats were raised different. But interesting is that the cattle that were raised at at the settlement of Bagasra had a lot of C4 compared to one that we have at Kotadapadli. Now that's because the settlement of Bagasra had access to a lot of agricultural fodder, which the settlement of Kotadapadli didn't. Another reason is that Kotadapadli itself was not doing a lot of cultivation. It had to rely on the neighboring settlements to get access to agricultural fodder or agricultural product to a certain extent. And that's one of the reasons why we see this kind of a mixed diet rather than a very strong C4 rich diet. Now, our data is very similar to their goat data. The other reason is that their goats, a certain time of the year, would have access to the C4 grasses, very green, tender C4 grasses. And when goats can have those green, tender grasses, they often consume the green, tender grasses. But once the grasses starts to get drier, they entirely shift from grasses to leaves. And that's why they have this huge difference. So say, for example, this is where our goats are. Our goats consumed primarily a lot of C3. That's again because they didn't have access to that much of green, tender agricultural fodder. Now, so we understood, okay, how animals were raised and how different settlements, say, for example, Kotadapadli being a regional rural settlement versus Bagasra, a very classical Harappan, huge town-like settlement, had differential access to fodder and a different way of raising their animals. Now, it was important for me also to identify how these animal products were utilized or how animals were utilized. Now, there has been thousands of studies where they have analyzed bones from settlements, from large settlements, and it's fairly well established that during the Indus civilization, they raised cattle, buffalo, sheep, and goat, but they also consumed a wide variety of wild animals. For example, they consumed deer, they consumed pig. It's still not quite established if pig were domesticated or they were wild. But whatever the situation is, they consumed a lot of pigs. They consumed other wild animals. Say, for example, in Gujarat, they consumed a lot of nilgai. They consumed birds. They consumed fish. They consumed turtle. So anything and everything available at the vicinity of their settlements they consumed. We also have evidence that fish to certain large settlements were so important that, say, for example, at Harappa, fish were coming from all the way down from the sea. So fish were dried and moved from all the way to the sea to the settlement of Harappa that was way, way, way north. So there are certain foods that were considered to be to be elite and considered to be and having such access is possible for settlements like Harappa, because they were large settlements and they had these resources to kind of establish such kind of a network. But when we talk about settlements like Kotadapadli, they didn't have that network, so they had to rely on whatever resources they have or whatever resources they can regionally acquire rather than going to these different regions. So yeah, as I was telling, that a lot of studies have been done and we know what animals were consumed, but we don't know how those animals were consumed. Say, for example, we know that cattle were consumed for meat. We know sheep and goat were consumed for meat. We don't know which animal were consumed for dairy or milk to a certain extent, because evidence of milk is not there in archaeological data. There are ways, there are proxies that we can produce to identify milk. For example, when an animal was butchered, like if the animal was butchered when the animal was young, they were likely to be butchered for their meat because their meat will be tender at that time. But when an animal was butchered when they were old, it's likely that the animal were utilized for secondary products, for example, dairy and traction. There's very little evidence, especially in South Asian archaeology, where we can separate between those animals that were used for milk versus those animals that were used for traction. Now, there are ways, but that's something has not been studied so much. And at the same time, like fish is something, when we are talking about large fish, then they have larger bones, but most of the fish, they don't. so they don't often, preserve in archaeological conditions. Sometimes feet otoliths, the stone that we often find in fish, are preserved in archaeological context, and it is possible to identify the species of the fish based on the stones. But other than that, in some instances we come across with fish vertebrae, but that's all. Like it's very unlikely that smaller settlements would have a lot of evidence of fish. So in order to understand how these people were exploiting their surrounding and consuming the resources they can acquire or produce, I went ahead and did the ceramic residue analysis of archaeological vessels. Now, I am the first person so far in India who has actually done applied this method to Indian archaeological material. So nobody before me have applied that, and I've got excellent results. And after me, there have been a couple of studies where they have also applied this method, and they have found great data. So just to give you a sense, we had animal fats, we had fish oil, and vegetable oil at this settlement. Just let me check the time. No. At the settlement, so we had a lot of milk coming from cattle. We had a lot of milk that are coming from cattle, sheep, goat, and possibly some animals such as non-ruminant animals, could be pig, could be bird, or things like that. But a lot of data, or a lot of milk that they were consuming were coming from cattle, and this is the paper that got accepted in Nature, because we're the first to identify that during the Indus civilization, the source of milk were coming from cattle, and this is the first time we have direct evidence that milk were consumed during this time. So in terms of movement of animals, again, the settlement of Bagasra had animals that were coming from all over this region. So this is the strontium data. So we also analyzed strontium from animals to see the movement of animals at Kotatabadli and compared to the neighboring larger settlements. So at these larger settlements, there were animals coming from all over this part. But when we took to the samples from Kotatabadli, their movement was quite confined to the neighboring region. Now, that could be a matter of access to resources, access to landscape that they can take the animals to, or the nature of the settlement is so small that they had to rely on whatever available in their vicinity rather than larger settlements. Because their network, they could access materials from different regions, so inter-regional, inter-boundary material they had access to. Now, as I was saying, that there is indication of ash at the settlement. So even at the settlement of Kotatabadli, we had this ash, huge. So this fortification wall is 5 meters. So you can imagine how much ash it is, and it is all over the settlement, all over this settlement wall. We don't have it in the residential area, but mostly around the settlement wall. Now, this ash was identified to be a product of conflict, but it is not. So when I analyzed the content of the ash, it appears, so I have found evidence of dung, and I have also found evidence of phytoliths. So these are all different gas phytoliths that we found in the ash. So a huge portion of this ash was due to the burning of animal dung rather than due to the burning of settlements. And if a settlement were raising animals, any settlement raising animals, that animal would produce a lot of dung. Now, it is possible that during the Indus period, dung was not possibly used as manure. So not a lot of dung were exchanged between agricultural settlements and pastoral settlements, or some of it may have been and some of it may not. And the amount of dung they produced at the settlement were dumped along the settlement wall and burned, and that caused this ash rather than conflict. So they were not fighting. They were keeping their settlements clean. So now coming to the conclusion is that we will never get this sort of evidence of how settlements were functioning regionally and how settlements were functioning interregionally, how the interactions between the core and the peripheries within the Indus civilization, until we look into these smaller settlements. It's very important we look into smaller settlements. It's very important that we break this top-down mode of interpretation. we stop looking at these bigger settlements. Yes, they're important, but also it's important that we consider it as regions, as units, and study them in detail. Then only we will know how this civilization works. It's like, it's like putting the map of India, like you draw a boundary and you say everybody is same. No, everybody is not same. They were different. They had different access to resources. They had different traditions. But then there is also a mixing of tradition, mixing of ideas, mixing of people, mixing of technologies. There is a lot of imitation. We see at the settlement of Kotarabadli that they were imitating beads that are found in the core region from a very different material. So they didn't have access to the material that were available at the core or at the larger settlement. So they found whatever available in the local, and they started imitating. They started building those products. So we can see a clear transfer of ideas. So it's not necessarily that the product got moved from the core region to the peripheral region, but it's the idea. And now the idea may not be a direct movement of ideas. Thus, ideas could move from different angles, from different ways. So it is very important that we focus on this kind of movement, and that's why the regional movement exchange and peripheral effects are important. Because if I draw a huge map of Indus civilization that we often see in our textbook, it's wrong. It's not everybody is part of the Indus civilization. They were possibly using the traits that are available in the Indus civilization, but they may not like Indus people. They may hate them. They don't like them. It's possible, but they still use their the material traits, or they may like them. They wanted to be like them. They wanted to follow them, and they wanted to develop into this larger settlement. So there is a lot of socio-political things happening within this civilization. So if we call them as one civilization, if we call them they're all same, it's gonna hamper our interpretation for sure. And also it will help, like how these peripheral regions were working is important to know, because these peripheral regions have provided them with a lot of resources. Say, for example, the Kotarabadli had these animals as a resource, and they gave those animal resources to larger settlements who were producing craft, and that interaction was essential for the survival of the Indus civilization in this region, even though the climate was not the best. So they were not adapting to the climate, but they were coming together, solving a problem collaboratively to sustain, to live, to prosper. And that's why one of the reason is that even the Indus civilization died out in this region, they continued over here for a long period of time. So in conclusion, as I said, yes, it's important that Sora trait that we see is regional trait, and it's important that we treat them as regional trait rather than as part of Indus civilization, because that's a perspective will create a problem. The sedentary and semi-sedentary pastoralism that they were doing was important for them, and that's how they were getting resources, and that was the main resource they were using to create this regional contact. Now, when I talk about the resource, it's not a raw material, because we see different materials were valued differently. Milk from cattle were valued differently than milk from goat, because goats can produce milk as well. So there were values associated with products. So it was not a product that I developed. It's not an arrowhead that I developed to kill a deer. But sometimes arrowhead would also have meanings behind it. So yeah. I would also like to thank the supports and collaborations that I have received during my PhD, because I've done a lot of scientific studies, and it was important that I have access to all these labs, as well as theoretical orientations. So thank you to all these institutes. So yeah, this is the settlement of Kotarabadli, and as I was telling that how big that settlement wall is. So I'm close to 6 feet. So that's me, just part of it, and then you can see it's probably another person can stand on top of me just to reach to the. So that's another evidence of how high the settlement wall was, but it's a broken part of it. So when it was functioning, it was even higher. So yeah, that was our team once we were excavating the settlement of Kotarabadli. Thank you. I would be happy if you have any questions or comments.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for that very enlightening talk. We don't have very specific questions from our audience, but they, all of them, I mean, more than 150 people have joined us. I was just seeing the YouTube live thing, and they were, most of the comments were that, it's very informative, it's wonderful, and it's brilliant. So I would actually ask, because I'm not from anthropology, even though my thesis was somewhat related to cultural anthropology, because I was working on the study of myths, and while doing that, I was looking at Levi-Strauss. But beyond that, I have very little knowledge of anthropology. So therefore, I would request our principal madam, Dr. Oprita Mondal-Nandi, to take over the session and ask a few questions, because she is from this field, and we are looking forward to her questions.
I am from anthropology, no doubt, but anthropology is so vast, as you can see. And Kalyan has gone to such an extension of archaeology, and he has combined the technology and scientific methods also in his studies. So it has gone beyond anthropology, I suppose. So, and I'm not quite affluent with this area of anthropology. Kalyan knows that very well. Anyhow, Kalyan, I congratulate you on your extensive study and on your article published in Nature. That has really made us very proud. And coming to today's session, it was very, very informative. It was something very different for us. We have been into archaeology. We have been doing archaeological anthropology. There are studies, but mostly they are theory-based. So your fieldwork and your extensive research has really brought up some highlights, and it's really very enriching. And coming to your study here that you presented today, what I would say is no wonder why Gujarat has Amul today there. Anyhow, so about borderland studies that you have mentioned here, about the pastoralism and the influences of the neighboring areas. Did you find any evidence regarding religious motives or beliefs or some sort of things which they shared with the people in the neighboring areas? Did you have any such evidence?
So I know many people have talked about religion and religious motives during in the civilization. So, for example, the famous the Pasupati seal, the people lives on the pottery vessels. Now that's slightly biased, coming from a Vedic religion perspective. To what extent, like scientifically, to what extent we can extend that all the way to the Indus civilization is problematic. I am not denying the possibility. There could definitely be a possibility, but to what extent it is true, I don't know. In terms of religious activities, the information we have from Indus civilization is so fragmentary that it is very difficult to interpret if certain thing has any religious values. But at the same time, there were symbolic values. Say, for example, cattle meat. I didn't go in detail. Cattle meat were only consumed ritualistic situations or ceremonial situations. It was not a common meat. It was not a meat that you will consume every day. The everyday meat was goat. Cattle was something that you will consume when it is a feast, when it is something ritual practice, some ceremonies is when you'll eat cattle. Now there is a utilitarian purpose to that, is that cattle would produce a lot of meat, and you need a lot of people to finish that meat. But other than that, in terms of ritualistic objects, we don't have evidence of any sort of ritualistic objects that might have moved between these regions.
Because with human beings and with society, you have religious beliefs or these practices related to your economy also. That is why I asked this question, because if they are pastoral, if pastoralism was so dominant over there, So they must have some sort of belief or something, sort of a ritual there.
Yeah, one interesting thing is that, so that's very hypothetical. Don't quote me on that. Is that so? In South Indian Neolithic, we see these ash mounds. Those are also burned cattle dung, and they were ritualistically burned to form a mound, seasonally ritualistically burned. Now that's a very you can associate rituals and religion to that practice. Now we don't see that practice in the civilization, but another reason is that we can have similar practice but not similar evidence. So for example, the cow dung that was burned at the settlement of Kotarabadli could have been a ritualistic practice. So I call them, it's a very a very practical practice, but it could also be a ritualistic practice, because many of our rituals are practical. Like if you look into them, they're practical. Like they're not often, yeah, sometimes they could be
Yes.
different, but oftentimes they're very practical. They have a reason behind it. They have a meaning behind it. And when a practice turns into, we have seen a practice turns into a ritual. So those cow dung burning could be part of a ritual as well, but we don't know that.
And again, coming to depending on borderlands, you mentioned here that they were much dependent on borderland places for fodder, for animal fodder,
Yeah.
because given to the geography of the region. So, was there any such evidence of barter system, like in exchange? What did that place receive from Kotatapalli?
Yeah. So in terms of so before I come into barter, in terms of formal markets, were there any formal market during the Indus civilization? Possibly yes. We don't have evidence of formal markets, but this kind of, so at Kotarabadli there is another argument, not from my side but from other people, is that Kotarabadli was kind of a caravanserai of in the civilization, where people from different region will come to Kotarabadli and then they will go. So it's a kind of a motel on a trade route. That's one of the arguments. But barter was definitely, because that's what I was telling you, is that the craft we see at Kotarabadli are finished. So they were not producing them, they were acquiring them. And in return of what? Like, for example, grains. I haven't talked a lot about grains because of the time. So at Kotarabadli, we don't have evidence of agriculture. They were unlikely that they were producing they were doing cultivation at this site. It could be that the preservation was not good and we didn't find any grains, but it could also be that they were not producing grains. Now, when they were not producing grains, and we see that they were having agricultural fodder for their animals, so they were acquiring them through either formal market or informal market. It could be just kinship-based relationship with another agricultural society, or some kinship-based relationship to another craft-producing society from where they were grabbing those materials. But at the same time, it could be a very formal market barter system from where they were getting these things. But it is very unlikely that they had a centralized market system at that time.
Thank you so much. It was very nice listening to your lecture.
Thank you, madam. Sir, just as a parting note, I would, from the perspective of English literature, I would sort of, or literatures for any language, I would just like to know this, because I'm into Amitav Ghosh, and he's a very favorite author of mine, and Amitav Ghosh claims that he has been doing a lot of work in anthropology. And when he's writing these novels like The Gun Island, and The Hungry Tide, he's basically, talking about the folk tales of the regions and stuff like that. Taking cue from Amitav Ghosh, the thing that I would like to ask you, sir, is this: that as far as the Indus Valley civilization is concerned, from a layman's point of view, from an outsider's point of view, we have lots of myths encircling the Harappan civilization. This happened and that happened, and we have that incredibly bad film of Hrithik Roshan. It's just it's a terrible film. But anyways, sorry to say
myths,
that.
and in addition to that, hypothesis.
Yeah, exactly. So the thing is that when you are sort of working in the field, where does the myth end and where does the science begin?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. We know there are so many hypotheses. When I personally work in the field is to go beyond the biasness of the mind. You know, if I need to see something in something, I'll see it. That's how the mind works, right? So I will leave all my rational thoughts and I'll see, oh, I see it there because I want to see it, right? So my approach is to, like, if there is enough evidence to say 1 + 1 is 2, or if there is not. If there is no, then I would say, then I would come with that probabilities. Like, even my thesis had full of hypotheses. Now, one of the reasons is that the data we acquire is not enough, is not strong enough that we can claim something. A lot of things I say today are hypotheses, are mostly in the form of hypotheses, because it's one site, one settlement. I haven't done hundreds of settlements. This study has been done in one settlement. So what I see at this settlement may be completely different at other settlements. So we don't know that. So that's my approach, is to kind of go with that kind of possibility approach, is that this is a possibility, that's a possibility, that's a possibility, that's a possibility. At the same time, you know, not everything we can explain through science. But what is the other option then? We have literature during the Indus civilization that are not deciphered yet. We don't know what they were writing. So what other evidence do I have? Like, can I build a story out of something? Can I build a story out of 2 people live in a pottery? Yes, I can. I can build a story. I can take ethnographic evidences. I can take middle approach. All these evidences I can put together and build a story. But how long, to what extent I can prove the story? Like, to me, no, I cannot prove the story. So it would still remain a hypothesis.
Right.
Actually, to reconstruct the past is a very, very difficult thing, because it's a continuous process. You cannot conclude somewhere. Right.
No. And especially in India, we don't have that continuation. We don't have that continuation of tradition, because the tradition has been raptured multiple times by multiple people, by multiple organizations, by multiple situations, right? So we see a tradition, continuation of a tradition, but because of that kind of disturbances, can we trace it back all the way to its origin? Possibly yes, possibly no, but it's tough. It's tough for Indian context.
Right. Thank you so much, sir. I think we can sort of part off with the words that Kevin was talking about. That in Derridian world, there is nothing called the absolute. There is nothing called the center. Everything is a flow. So, we talk of narrativizations and all sorts of things. So, thank you so much, sir, for joining us all the way from Canada. You are far off, maybe by a distance, but you are very close to us in our hearts. So thank you very much for joining, and I really can't thank you enough. Another thing, I know there's another thank you over here. I know that this, I'm doing this every day, but thank you, IFEST team. They have said, repeatedly that they're not going to advertise themselves in our platform. That is not their policy, but let me advertise it for them, sir, for them. They're a wonderful team of people, and whenever we have faced technical glitches, which is very normal in the new normal, they have taken care of that. They have, given the solutions to us, and in fact, they are, posting the comments over here as well from the YouTube. So they are such wonderful people. So thank you, IFEST. And for the paper presenters, let me say this: that we are going to begin at 10:30 tomorrow, 10:30. And we are going to have our session with Professor Ernest Emenyonu, who is a giant in African American literature. He is one of the biggest names of the 21st century. We are very, very lucky to have him, just like we are very lucky to have a luminary like Professor Chakraborty. So, this seminar is going to the stellar. It's as simple as that.
And we are enjoying the seminar because we are having different people from different area of science.
Parts of the world, absolutely.
Yes.
So that is
under the same topic. Yeah.
Absolutely. So that is it for today. We have had a long, hard day. So goodbye for now, and we are going to join tomorrow at 10:30. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Take care, Kalyan. Thank you.
Thank you, man. Bye.